So in this particular test, we want to evaluate whether we want to accept or reject a null hypothesis. And we have, let's say we have done a test. We have, for example, said that our null hypothesis should be that, for example, there is no difference between the population means from which the two samples were taken. So we can write this as mu1 minus mu2 equals 0. We can also write that, and that would be also a valid null hypothesis, that mu1 equals mu2, and these are the population means from the populations from which we draw the samples. So this would be our null hypothesis. Our alternative hypothesis could be either that one of the population means is larger than the other. So we can write this as mu1 is smaller than mu2, or mu1 is larger than the mean of the second population. Or we can also have just simply saying that the population means are different for the two populations. In this case, we would use a one-tailed test. In this case, we would use a two-tailed test if we are testing that in a hypothesis testing. Now we've done that, and in this case we got a p-value. So p-value in this case here is 0.054, and we always compare the p-value with our significance level alpha, and here in this case alpha is 5%, and we can also write this as 0.05. And we can say if p is larger than alpha, we accept our null hypothesis and say there is no difference. And if p is smaller than alpha, we can reject the null hypothesis and say yes, there is. So that means there is a difference between the samples. Is a difference between, and I probably should say between the two populations from which the samples are drawn, and therefore that means also difference between the two samples. Difference between the two samples that we are dealing with. So if p is low, p is lower than alpha. If p is low, h naught must go. If p is high, is higher than alpha, then h naught can stay. And you really need to say that with an Australian accent, which I obviously can't do. And in this case, we accept the null hypothesis. So in this case, we have our p of 0.054, and this is indeed 0.054 is larger than alpha of 0.05, and therefore we would accept our null hypothesis, and in this case we would say there's no statistically significant difference between the two populations. We do not reject our null hypothesis, and we say there's nothing really terribly exciting going on. There is no difference between the two sample means.